Tonight, we return to a man standing on a shore. The island is behind him. The water is still moving in the strait, the way water moves when it has no opinion about what just happened on the sand above it. The man in the boat is not celebrating. He is not explaining himself to anyone. He is simply sitting with the specific and total silence that follows the thing you have spent your entire life moving toward and finding, for the first time, that the silence has a question in it that the sword cannot answer. His name is Miyamoto Musashi, and the duels are over. Not because he lost, not because the world ran out of opponents willing to face him, but because something shifted on that island in the strait on a spring morning in 1612. Something that no victory could have shifted, and that only the completion of something can shift. The specific and quiet recognition that the chapter is finished, and the next chapter requires a different instrument entirely. Tonight we follow him into that next chapter, into the decades after the sword, into the studio and the garden and the mountain and the cave, into the paintings that still exist and the sculptures that are still held, and the book that is still read by people who have never held a sword and never will. We will follow him all the way to the cave at Reigando, in the mountains above Kumamoto, where an old man sat down in the dark with a brush and wrote everything he had learned into a book that the world has been carrying ever since. My name is Henry, and this is Boring Japanese History. If part 1 brought you here, if the road from Harima and the field of Sekigahara and the morning on the island carried you through the night and into something that felt like rest, then consider subscribing. There are more stories coming, more rooms and more rivers and more lives lived so completely that the world still feels the shape of them. And tonight, we finish one of the greatest of those lives. But for now, close your eyes. Let your shoulders find the floor. Let the water come to you. The specific and unhurried water of the Kanmon Strait on a spring morning, moving the way it always moves, indifferent and clean, and carrying nothing on its surface except the light. There is a man in a boat. The island is receding behind him, growing smaller in the way that things grow smaller when you are moving away from them and not looking back. Shrinking from the place where everything happened into simply a place, a small piece of land in a strait, sand and trees, and the specific quality of silence that descends on a location after the significant thing that happened there has finished happening. He is 30 years old, or close enough to 30 that the difference does not matter. He has fought 60 duels and walked away from every one of them, and the walking away has always felt, until this morning, like a continuation. Like the road extending forward into the next thing the question requires. This morning it feels different. This morning, the walking away feels like an ending, not a defeat, not a loss, but the specific and clarifying completion of something that was always going to end here, that could only have ended here, on this water, in this light, with the sound of the oar moving through the strait, and the island getting smaller behind him, and the mainland getting larger ahead. The sword is at rest beside him in the boat. The fashioned wooden sword, the one he made from the spare oar during the crossing, the one that was exactly long enough, and exactly nothing more than long enough, is lying on the planks of the boat, with the specific and ordinary quality of a tool that has done what it was made to do, and is now simply an object again. Wood and weight, and the faint smell of the water it was shaped beside. He looks at it for a long time, and somewhere in the looking, in the specific and quiet attention he brings to the piece of wood lying in the bottom of a boat on a spring morning in 1612, something begins. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in the way that beginnings announce themselves in the stories that are told about them afterward, but quietly, the way the most important beginnings always begin, which is to say, like something that was already there, being noticed for the first time. Like a door that has been in the wall for years, finally being seen. The second half of the life of Miyamoto Musashi begins in a boat on the Kanmon Strait, with a man looking at a piece of wood and beginning, without yet knowing that he is beginning, to understand that the question he has been asking with the sword has always been a larger question than the sword could answer. That the sword was the way into the question, but not the way through it. That the way through it requires something else, something quieter and slower, and in some ways more demanding than anything the duels required. Something that will take the rest of his life to learn, and the last 2 weeks of his life to write down. We begin. But the man in the boat is not done yet. He is looking at something in the bottom of the boat, a piece of wood, and beginning to understand what it means. The mainland receives him the way the mainland receives everyone who crosses the strait, which is to say without ceremony, without the kind of environmental acknowledgement that the significance of the crossing seems to require, with the specific and indifferent hospitality of a shore that has been receiving people from boats for longer than anyone currently alive can remember, and that has no particular investment in the meaning of any individual arrival. The boat touches the dock and the ropes are tied, and the man steps off onto the planks with the wooden sword under his arm, and the specific quality of stillness that has followed him out of every significant encounter. And the mainland does what the mainland does, which is to continue being the mainland, solid and various, and entirely unorganized around the fact that someone important has just stepped onto it. The people who were on the island, the witnesses, the retainers of the Lord who sanctioned the engagement, the people whose function was to observe and attest to what happened on the sand between Miyamoto Musashi and Sasaki Kojiro on the morning of the 13th day of the 4th month of the year 1612. These people are already in the process of doing what witnesses do, which is to say they are already converting what they saw into a story, already finding the shape that will allow the event to be transmitted to people who were not there, already making the small and largely unconscious decisions about what to include and what to leave out, and what to emphasize, that will determine how the event is remembered for the next 400 years. The story they are making will become the legend. The legend will become the cultural fixture. The cultural fixture will become the thing that people mean when they say the name Ganryujima, which is not yet the name of the island, but will be by tomorrow. Named for the man who lost, rather than the man who won, which is the specific and interesting choice that the story makes, and that says something true about what the story is actually about. Musashi is not making a story. This is one of the ways he is different from the witnesses, one of the ways he is always different from the people who surround significant events in his life and immediately begin the work of narrative construction that the human need to make sense of experience requires. He is inside the experience rather than outside it, still present to it in the specific and total way that his quality of attention makes available, not yet at the distance from which narrative becomes possible, not yet able to see the shape of what happened because he is still inside the shape, still in the specific and unglamorous interior of an experience that has not yet resolved itself into the form that experience takes when it has been processed enough to be described. What he is inside is something that does not have a clean name in the vocabulary of victory, something that is not the opposite of triumph, but is not triumph either, something that occupies the space where triumph was expected and finds that the space is larger and stranger than triumph would have filled, that the completion of the thing he has been moving toward for 30 years has produced not the satisfaction of arrival, but the specific and disorienting openness of a person who has reached the destination they were organized around, and found that the destination, now that they are standing in it, is not a place to stay, but a place to leave from, a threshold rather than a room. The sword is still under his arm. He has been carrying it since the island, and he will carry it for a while longer. Not because he needs it, not because the road ahead requires it in the way the road behind required it, but because putting it down requires a decision that he has not yet made, that he is not yet ready to make, that requires a clarity about what comes next, that the specific and strange openness of the post-island days has not yet provided. The sword is familiar in the way that the things we have organized our lives around become familiar, not merely useful, but present in a way that goes beyond utility. A presence whose absence would feel like the absence of something structural rather than merely practical, like removing a wall rather than moving a piece of furniture. The days after the island have a quality that Musashi has not encountered before in his life, a quality that he does not initially have a word for, and that he approaches with the same focused attention he brings to everything, trying to understand it clearly enough to know what it requires of him. It is not grief, or not only grief, though there is something in it that resembles the specific weight of loss, the particular heaviness of a person who has put down something they were carrying for a long time, and finds that the absence of the weight does not feel like relief, but like disorientation, like the body still leaning into a resistance that is no longer there. It is not regret. This needs to be said clearly, because the accounts that come after, the legends and the stories and the various interpretations that accumulate around the Musashi narrative over the centuries, sometimes shade the post-Ganryujima period in the colours of regret. Sometimes suggest that the defeat of Kojiro produced in Musashi a crisis of conscience, a reconsideration of the path that the years of dueling represented, a retrospective guilt about the cost of the excellence he pursued. This is not what the life suggests when you look at it without the overlay of the legend, not the texture of the years that follow the island when you trace them carefully through the available sources. What the life suggests is not regret, but something more interesting and more honest, which is the specific and searching quality of a person who has completed something genuine and is in the process of discovering that the completion has opened rather than closed the question, that the answer the sword provided is a real answer, but not the whole answer. That the whole answer requires something the sword cannot reach. He moves through the provinces in the years after the island, with the same physical pattern as the years before it, the Musha Shugyo continuing, the road still the primary condition of the life, the movement through unfamiliar geography still the mechanism through which the question is being pursued. But the quality of the movement is different, has a different interior texture, is organized around a different relationship to the practice than the relationship that organized it before. Before the island, the movement was directed, was aimed at something specific, was the movement of a person who knew what the question required and was going to the places where it could be asked and answered in the only honest way, which is directly, through engagement with serious opponents in conditions that were real and consequential. After the island, the movement is more exploratory, less certain of its destination, organized around a question that has changed its shape, and whose new shape he is still in the process of mapping. The duels continue for a while. This is the part of the post-Ganryujima period that the legends tend to gloss over. The years in which the engagements that defined the first half of the life are still happening, but are happening differently, are happening with a different quality of presence on Musashi's part, a quality that the opponents who face him in these years sometimes note and cannot quite account for, describing it in terms that suggest they are encountering someone who is fully present for the engagement, but not fully invested in it, who is bringing everything the practice has given him, but is not bringing the specific and organizing urgency that the earlier engagements carried. The urgency of a person for whom the outcome matters in a way that goes beyond the immediate and physical to the fundamental and existential. The outcomes are the same. The record continues unblemished. The opponents continue to go down with the specific and consistent regularity that 60 engagements across a career produce when the career is organized around the kind of practice that Musashi's has been organized around. But the victories have a different weight now, carry a different quality of meaning, or perhaps more accurately, carry a diminishing quality of meaning, each one adding less to the question than the one before it, each one confirming what has already been confirmed so many times that the confirmation has stopped being informative and started being simply repetitive. And repetition in the service of a question that has already been answered is not practice. It is something else. Something that the tradition he has been operating within does not have a clean name for, but that he is beginning to understand as the specific and honest signal that this part of the path has been walked as far as it goes. There is a particular kind of emptiness that belongs only to the completion of long projects, and it is different from ordinary emptiness in the way that the silence after a piece of music ends is different from silence that has no music behind it. The silence after the music contains the music, is shaped by it, has the specific contours of what just ended, rather than the formless quality of silence that has not been preceded by anything. The emptiness that Musashi carries in the years after Ganryujima is this kind of emptiness, shaped by what filled it for 30 years, carrying within it the specific and identifiable absence of the thing that organized the life for so long that the life without it has a shape that is defined by the absence rather than by what is present. He begins to notice things that he did not notice before, or that he noticed but did not attend to with the quality of attention that he is now finding available for them. The way a craftsman holds a tool, the specific and practiced quality of a carpenter's hands moving through wood with the particular combination of force and delicacy that the material requires, the wood yielding to the blade in a way that is neither passive nor resistant but cooperative, as if the wood and the blade have reached an understanding about what the wood wants to become, and the blade is simply helping it arrive there. The way a calligrapher moves the brush across paper, the specific and unhurried confidence of a hand that has made this movement 10,000 times, and has stopped thinking about the movement and started simply making it. The brush leaving behind it on the paper, not just the character, but the quality of the attention that produced the character, the specific and readable trace of a mind that was fully present for what the hand was doing. These observations are not new in the sense of being observations he has never made before. He has been moving through a world full of craftspeople and artists and practitioners of various disciplines for 30 years, and the quality of attention he brings to everything he encounters means that nothing in his environment has ever been entirely invisible to him. What is new is the relationship between the observation and the question. The way these things that he has always noticed are now connecting to something in him that was previously occupied by the duels and the road and the specific and forward-directed urgency of the Musha Shugyo that is now available for a different kind of engagement, a slower and more interior engagement, an engagement that does not happen in the space between two people with weapons, but in the space between a person and the material they are working with, and the specific and intimate relationship that develops between the two when the person is fully present for it. He picks up a brush. The accounts do not preserve the specific moment of this, do not give us the particular morning or the specific location or the exact circumstances in which Miyamoto Musashi first applied ink to paper with the deliberate intention of making something rather than simply writing. What the accounts preserve is the result, the paintings that survive from the later decades of the life, the ink brushwork that scholars and collectors and people who know nothing about martial arts have found genuinely moving, genuinely accomplished, genuinely expressive of something that is not merely the competent production of a person who learned a skill, but the specific and recognizable trace of a particular and irreplaceable way of seeing. The brush in the hand is not the sword in the hand. This is obvious, and it is also not obvious, because the things that are obvious at the level of the physical, the different weight and the different material, and the different purpose, and the entirely different relationship to the person on the other end of the thing, are not obvious at the level of the principle, the level at which Musashi has always operated, the level at which the sword was never only a sword, but was always also an instrument for investigating something about the relationship between a person and the fullest expression of what they are capable of. At this level, the level of principle, the brush and the sword are asking the same question, and the answer the brush requires is the same answer the sword required, which is the answer of complete presence, of the attention fully organized around the thing being done, of the self neither absent from the work nor imposed upon it, but simply there, available, in the specific and sustaining way that makes the work possible. The province of Igusa receives him for a period in the years after the island, and then the province of Ogura, and then the approaches to Eda, the new city that the Tokugawa administration is building into the center of its power, with the specific and purposeful energy of a regime that understands that architecture is also a kind of argument, that the shape of the city you build is a statement about the kind of order you intend to impose, and the kind of permanence you intend to achieve. Musashi moves through the construction of this new order with the familiar quality of a person who is adjacent to the structures of power rather than inside them, observing the reorganization of the country around its new center with the detached and interested attention of someone who has no institutional stake in the outcome and is therefore free to see it clearly. He takes students in these years. This is one of the less dramatic but more significant developments of the post-Ganryujima period. The beginning of a relationship to the transmission of knowledge that represents a genuine departure from the solitary practice that defined the first half of the life. The boy who refused to attach himself to a school, the young man who walked out of Harima without a teacher, and maintained throughout the years of the Musha Shugyo a fundamental independence from every institutional framework that the martial world offered, is now in the position of the teacher, is now the person to whom others come with the specific and serious intention of learning what he has to teach. The teaching is different from what the schools offer, or at least different in its emphasis, in the things it considers central and the things it treats as peripheral. Where the schools transmit technique, Musashi transmits principle, or tries to, which is harder and slower, and requires of both the teacher and the student a kind of patience that the transmission of technique does not require, because technique can be demonstrated and copied in ways that principle cannot. Principle has to be understood, and understanding is not the same as copying, is not something that happens through the repetition of the teacher's movements until the movements are accurate, but something that happens through the student's own engagement with the question that the movements are answering, through the specific and interior process of arriving at the same place the teacher arrived at, but arriving there through the student's own path rather than through the teacher's. This commitment to the student's own path over the teacher's established route is one of the things that makes Musashi an unusual teacher, and one of the things that makes the students who genuinely learn from him different from the students who merely train under him. The ones who genuinely learn are the ones who understand that what they are being given is not a system to be followed, but a question to be asked, not a map, but a compass. Not the answer, but the way of finding the answer, that the answer requires each person to find for themselves. These students are not many. The patience required to learn this way is not common, and the willingness to remain in the uncertainty of genuine inquiry, rather than the comfort of received technique, is not something that most people, however serious their intentions, can sustain for the length of time that genuine inquiry requires. He paints in the evenings, or in the mornings, or whenever the specific quality of light and silence that the painting requires is available. The paintings are not decorative, are not the competent production of a person filling the hours with a pleasant activity, are not the martial artist's hobby that the legend sometimes reduces them to. They are investigations, conducted with the same quality of seriousness that the duels were conducted with, into the same question that the duels were investigating. The question of what complete presence looks like when it is expressed through a medium that does not allow for the kind of direct and immediate feedback that the sword provides, that requires a different, and in some ways more demanding kind of trust. The trust of a person who cannot know in the moment of making whether what they are making is what they intend, who must rely entirely on the quality of the attention brought to the making, and accept whatever the making produces as the honest record of that attention. There is a specific and recurring quality in the paintings that survive from this period of Musashi's life, a quality that scholars describe in various ways and that the various descriptions circle around without quite landing on. A quality of economy, of the line that goes exactly where it needs to go and stops exactly where it needs to stop, that does not add to itself beyond what the subject requires and does not subtract from itself beyond what honesty allows, that is neither sparse nor full, but precisely sufficient. And the precision of the sufficiency is what makes it recognizable as the work of a specific and particular person, rather than the competent execution of a learned style. This economy is the same economy that practitioners who faced him in the duels describe when they try to articulate what made his technique different from the techniques of other serious practitioners they had encountered. The same absence of excess, the same refusal of the decorative, the same commitment to the movement that is exactly what the situation requires, and nothing more and nothing less. The sword and the brush are asking the same question, and they are receiving from the same person the same quality of answer. And this consistency, this recognizable signature across radically different media, is the thing that the life is demonstrating in these middle years. The thing that the second half of the Musashi story is about at the level of principle. The principle is this: mastery is not medium specific. The thing that Musashi has been developing since the field at the edge of the village in Harima, the quality of complete and organized presence that produces the specific and recognizable excellence visible in the paintings and the duels and the sculptures and the garden, is not a sword skill or a painting skill or a carving skill, but something that underlies all of these, something that is available to any medium that the person brings it to, that expresses itself differently in different materials, but is recognizably the same thing in all of them. The way a voice is recognizably the same voice, whether it is speaking or singing or whispering in the dark. He is arriving at this principle slowly, and through the specific and unglamorous mechanism of direct experience across multiple domains. Not through theoretical reflection, but through the lived discovery that the brush requires from him the same thing the sword required, and the carving tool requires the same thing the brush requires, and that the thing all of them require is not something he has to develop for each new medium, but something he already has, something that was developed in the field in Harima, and confirmed on the plane of Sekigahara, and sharpened across 60 duels, and that is now, in the studios and the gardens and the quiet evenings of the middle years, being discovered to be larger and more various and more transferable than the medium through which it was originally developed suggested. The sword is put down gradually rather than all at once, the way things are put down when they have been carried for a long time. And the putting down is not a rejection, but a completion, not a turning away from, but a moving through. The sword becoming not an abandoned instrument, but a foundation, the thing that built the capacity that the brush and the carving tool and the garden and the book are now expressing in their different and various ways. He does not stop being the person who fought 60 duels and walked away from every one of them. He becomes, in addition to that person, the person who understood what the 60 duels were in service of, and who found, in the second half of a long and various life, the other instruments through which the same service could be rendered. The shore of Ganryujima is behind him now, not forgotten, not diminished, not reframed into something other than what it was, which is the morning when the most famous chapter of the life ended, and the less famous, but equally serious chapter began. It is simply behind him, the way all the shores he has walked away from are behind him, Harima and Sekigahara and Kyoto, and all the other places where something happened that added to the question without closing it. All of them receding into the specific and permanent past that the life carries forward as foundation rather than as destination, as the ground the present stands on rather than the place the present is trying to return to. The brush moves across the paper in the evening light. The ink is the specific dark of ink that has been prepared carefully, ground with patience, thinned to exactly the consistency the work requires. The sound of the brush on the paper is the sound of complete attention expressing itself through the only instrument currently available to it. And somewhere in that sound, quiet as it is, barely audible over the evening and the breathing and the distant movement of the world outside the room where the painting is happening, the question continues. Shh. Just breathe. The shore is behind you. The room is quiet. And the brush is moving. Good night. The Musha Shugyo ends the way most things end that have been going on long enough to feel permanent, which is to say, not with a declaration or a ceremony or a moment that announces itself clearly as the moment of ending, but gradually and then completely, the way a fire goes out when the wood has been consumed, not extinguished, but finished, having done what it was there to do, and now simply no longer present in the way it was present before. There is no document in which Musashi writes that he has decided to stop, no account of a final engagement after which he puts down the sword and announces that the pilgrimage is over and the next part of the life is beginning. What there is instead is the slow and observable shift in the pattern of the life, the increasing intervals between engagements, the increasing time spent in one place rather than moving between places, the increasing orientation of the days around the studio and the carving block and the brush, rather than the road and the dojo, and the specific and forward-directed urgency of a person who is going somewhere. The world around him is also changing in ways that make the Musha Shugyo a different proposition in the second and third decades of the 17th century than it was in the first. The Tokugawa peace is settling over the country with the specific and gradually increasing weight of an order that has decided what it is and is in the process of making everything conform to that decision, that is, converting the fluid and dangerous landscape of the Sengoku period, the landscape of competing lords and shifting allegiances, and the specific and violent possibility that characterized a country in which power was genuinely contested, into something more fixed, more predictable, more organized around the stable continuation of what exists, rather than the competitive replacement of what exists with something better or worse or simply different. This settling is good for most people and most purposes, but it is not entirely good for the kind of practice that the Musha Shugyo represents, because the Musha Shugyo requires a world in which serious engagement is genuinely available, in which the stakes of the encounter are real enough to produce the honest feedback that only real stakes produce. And the Tokugawa peace is in the process of making serious engagement harder to find, and the stakes of encounter more carefully managed, and the honest feedback of genuine consequence increasingly replaced by the controlled and consequence-free feedback of institutionalized practice. Musashi feels this change in the quality of what the road offers. Not immediately, not as a sudden awareness that the world has become something different, but gradually, through the accumulating evidence of engagements that are serious in form, but not quite serious in the way that the earlier engagements were serious, that are conducted by practitioners who have trained carefully and well within the new institutional frameworks that the Tokugawa order is producing, but who have not been tested in the conditions that the earlier practitioners were tested in, that carry a kind of excellence that is genuine but bounded, real within its own terms, but not extended to the limits that only genuine consequence can extend it to. The feedback they provide is honest as far as it goes, but it does not go as far as the feedback that the engagements of the first half of the life went. And the difference, however subtle, is enough to register in the specific and calibrated attention of a person who has been taking this measurement for 30 years and knows what the full extension of the thing feels like. He is not the same practitioner he was at 20 either. This is the other dimension of the change, the dimension that is harder to acknowledge because it requires an honesty about the body and its relationship to time that is not comfortable for a person whose identity has been organized around physical excellence. He is in his 30s now, and the 30s are not the 20s. And the body that moved through 60 duels with the specific and seemingly inexhaustible quality of physical excellence that the accounts describe is a body that has been used seriously and consistently for a long time, that has absorbed the accumulation of years of practice and engagement in the ways that bodies absorb such things, which is to say, both productively and at a cost, developing through the use while also being marked by it, carrying in the joints and the muscles and the specific quality of recovery the record of what the years have required. He does not stop because his body forces him to stop, does not arrive at the end of the Mushashugyo through injury or decline, or the specific and reluctant acknowledgement that the physical capacity that made the pilgrimage possible is no longer available in the form it once was. He stops, or begins to stop, because the question that the pilgrimage was asking has been asked completely enough that continuing to ask it in the same way is no longer the most honest way to pursue it, because the road has given what the road has to give. And the next thing the question requires is not more road, but something else. Something that the road cannot provide, and that requires him to stop moving long enough to find out what it is. The decision to stop fighting, or the process of arriving at the condition of having stopped fighting, is not a decision about fighting. This distinction is important enough to dwell on, because the legend of Musashi sometimes frames the second half of his life as a turn away from the sword, as if the paintings and the sculptures and the philosophy represent a rejection of what the duels represented, a recognition that the path of violence was wrong and the path of art and contemplation is the correction. This framing is clean and satisfying and almost entirely inaccurate, because it requires the two halves of the life to be in opposition when what the life actually demonstrates is continuity, the same question being pursued through different instruments, the same quality of attention expressed through different media, the same commitment to the complete and honest engagement with whatever the practice requires, expressed in forms that look different on the surface, but are organized around the same principle at the depth where the organization happens. What changes is not the commitment, but the instrument. And the instrument changes not because the previous instrument was wrong, but because it has been used as completely as it can be used, has given everything it has to give, has answered the part of the question it was capable of answering, and has, through the answering, revealed the part of the question that it cannot answer, the part that requires something else. The sword answered the question of what complete presence looks like in the context of immediate physical consequence, in the conditions where the feedback is instant and the cost of incomplete presence is immediate and unambiguous. What the sword cannot answer, what the sword by its nature is not designed to investigate, is what complete presence looks like in the absence of immediate consequence, in the slower and more interior conditions of making rather than encountering, of creation rather than response, of the long and unglamorous engagement with a material that does not fight back, but that resists in its own way, that has its own nature and its own requirements, and that will not yield to force or urgency, but only to the specific and patient quality of attention that understands what the material is and works with that understanding rather than against it. The brush resists differently than the opponent. The wood resists differently than the opponent. The garden resists differently than the opponent. But they all resist. And the resistance is honest in the way that all genuine resistance is honest. And the quality of attention that the resistance requires is the same quality of attention that the duels required. And this sameness is the thing that makes the second half of the life not a departure from the first half, but its continuation and its deepening. The same practice extended into new territory, the same question asked in a new language, the same commitment expressed through instruments that reveal dimensions of the commitment that the sword, for all its honesty, could not reach. He settles for a period in Ogura, in Kyushu, and the settling has a different quality than the stops he made during the years of the pilgrimage, a different relationship to the place and the time, less provisional, less organized around the intention of moving on when the available learning has been exhausted, and more organized around the slower and more interior project of understanding what the place has to offer to a person who is willing to stay long enough to find out. He takes students more seriously in this period, invests more of himself in the transmission project, in the specific and demanding work of finding language for the things that the practice has made available to him, and that language, with its necessary generalizations and its inevitable distance from the direct experience of the thing being described, can only approximate. The students who come to him in Ogura are serious people who have heard the record and understand something of what it represents, who come not with the casual intention of training under a famous practitioner for the prestige of the association, but with the genuine and sometimes slightly desperate intention of learning whatever it is that produces results like his, of getting close enough to the source of the thing to understand what the source is. Some of them are disappointed, because what they find is not the system they expected, not the organized and transmissible technique that the schools they previously trained in provided, but something more demanding and less comfortable, a teacher who keeps redirecting them from the question of how to the question of what, from the mechanics of the movement to the quality of attention the movement requires, from the form to the principle that the form is in service of. The decision to stop fighting, or the process of arriving at the condition of having stopped fighting, is not a decision about fighting. This distinction is important enough to dwell on, because the legend of Musashi sometimes frames the second half of his life as a turn away from the sword, as if the paintings and the sculptures and the philosophy represent a rejection of what the duels represented, a recognition that the path of violence was wrong and the path of art and contemplation is the correction. This framing is clean and satisfying and almost entirely inaccurate, because it requires the two halves of the life to be in opposition when what the life actually demonstrates is continuity. The same question being pursued through different instruments, the same quality of attention expressed through different media, the same commitment to the complete and honest engagement with whatever the practice requires, expressed in forms that look different on the surface, but are organized around the same principle at the depth where the organization happens. What changes is not the commitment, but the instrument. And the instrument changes not because the previous instrument was wrong, but because it has been used as completely as it can be used, has given everything it has to give, has answered the part of the question it was capable of answering, and has, through the answering, revealed the part of the question that it cannot answer, the part that requires something else. The sword answered the question of what complete presence looks like in the context of immediate physical consequence, in the conditions where the feedback is instant and the cost of incomplete presence is immediate and unambiguous. What the sword cannot answer, what the sword by its nature is not designed to investigate, is what complete presence looks like in the absence of immediate consequence, in the slower and more interior conditions of making rather than encountering, of creation rather than response, of the long and unglamorous engagement with a material that does not fight back, but that resists in its own way, that has its own nature and its own requirements, and that will not yield to force or urgency, but only to the specific and patient quality of attention that understands what the material is and works with that understanding rather than against it. The brush resists differently than the opponent. The wood resists differently than the opponent. The garden resists differently than the opponent. But they all resist. And the resistance is honest in the way that all genuine resistance is honest. And the quality of attention that the resistance requires is the same quality of attention that the duels required. And this sameness is the thing that makes the second half of the life not a departure from the first half, but its continuation and its deepening. The same practice extended into new territory, the same question asked in a new language, the same commitment expressed through instruments that reveal dimensions of the commitment that the sword, for all its honesty, could not reach. He settles for a period in Ogura, in Kyushu, and the settling has a different quality than the stops he made during the years of the pilgrimage, a different relationship to the place and the time, less provisional, less organized around the intention of moving on when the available learning has been exhausted, and more organized around the slower and more interior project of understanding what the place has to offer to a person who is willing to stay long enough to find out. He takes students more seriously in this period, invests more of himself in the transmission project, in the specific and demanding work of finding language for the things that the practice has made available to him, and that language, with its necessary generalizations and its inevitable distance from the direct experience of the thing being described, can only approximate. The students who come to him in Ogura are serious people who have heard the record and understand something of what it represents, who come not with the casual intention of training under a famous practitioner for the prestige of the association, but with the genuine and sometimes slightly desperate intention of learning whatever it is that produces results like his, of getting close enough to the source of the thing to understand what the source is. Some of them are disappointed, because what they find is not the system they expected, not the organized and transmissible technique that the schools they previously trained in provided, but something more demanding and less comfortable, a teacher who keeps redirecting them from the question of how to the question of what, from the mechanics of the movement to the quality of attention the movement requires, from the form to the principle that the form is in service of. The inner journey, the turn toward the interior that the end of the Mushashugyo represents, is not a turn away from difficulty. This is one of the ways the legend misrepresents the second half of the life, by suggesting that the move from the sword to the brush is a move from hardness to softness, from the demanding conditions of physical combat to the more forgiving conditions of artistic practice, from the world of consequence to the world of expression. The actual interior journey that Musashi undertakes in the decades after Ganryujima is harder in certain respects than the exterior journey that preceded it, harder in the specific ways that interior journeys are harder than exterior ones, which is to say, less legible, less mappable, less equipped with the clear feedback mechanisms that the sword provided, requiring the traveller to navigate by instruments that are more subtle and less reliable, and that cannot be calibrated against any external standard, because the territory they are mapping has no external standard, has only the honest and not always comfortable record of the practice itself. He is trying to understand something that he already knows in the body, but does not yet know in the mind, or rather, that he knows in the mind in the approximate and general way that principles are known before they have been articulated clearly, before the work of finding the right language for them has been done, before the specific and demanding translation from lived knowledge to expressible knowledge has been completed. The Five Rings, the book that he will eventually write in a cave above Kumamoto in the last weeks of his life, is the product of this translation project, is the result of decades of the specific and patient work of finding words for things that were initially available only as physical knowledge, only as the body's accumulated understanding of what the practice requires and what it produces. This translation work is not glamorous. It does not look, from the outside, like the kind of activity that produces a book that people will carry with them into boardrooms and onto training floors 5 centuries later. It looks like a man sitting with a brush and paper, trying to find the sentence that is honest enough to say what he is trying to say, failing, trying again, finding something closer, recognizing that closer is not the same as arrived, continuing. It looks like a man carving a piece of wood and understanding something about the relationship between intention and material that he did not understand before the carving, and then trying to understand how what he just understood connects to what he understood about that relationship from the 30 years of working with the sword, and then trying to find the language that holds both understandings in the same sentence without losing the specificity of either. The inner journey has no opponents. This is both its freedom and its difficulty. The thing that makes it available in a way the Musha Shugyo was not available, that does not require a world with genuine stakes and genuine consequence in order to proceed, that can be undertaken in the specific and increasingly managed peace of the Tokugawa order, without losing its essential seriousness. And it is also the thing that makes it harder in certain ways, that removes the external calibration that the sword provided, that leaves the practitioner entirely responsible for assessing the honesty of their own practice, without the unambiguous and immediate feedback of an opponent who is either going down or not going down. He develops practices for this self-calibration, ways of testing the quality of his own attention that do not require an opponent, but that are honest enough to be genuinely informative. The paintings are one of these practices, the paintings being the visible record of the quality of attention that produced them, readable by the person who made them as evidence of where the attention was fully present and where it was not, where the brush was moving from the principle and where it was moving from something else, from habit or convention, or the specific and comfortable tendency to produce what has worked before, rather than what the present moment actually requires. The sculptures are another, the carving tool being even more unforgiving than the brush, because the brush allows revision in a way that the carving tool does not, because ink on paper can be worked and reworked, while wood removed is wood removed, and the irreversibility of the material makes the quality of attention that the carving requires the quality of attention that has no margin for the absence of full presence. The years accumulate, with the specific and unglamorous regularity of years that are being lived fully rather than dramatically, that are organized around practice and transmission and the slow and interior work of understanding, rather than around the events and encounters that make for the kind of story that legends prefer. He is in his 40s now, and then his 50s, and the body carries the decades with the specific and honest weight that bodies carry time. when the time has been used seriously, not broken by the use, but marked by it, moving with a quality of deliberateness that the younger body did not need, because the younger body had the specific and unreflective ease of a physical instrument that has not yet learned to attend to its own operation. He moves to Edo for a period, and finds in the city that the Tokugawa administration is building into the center of its order a different kind of stimulus for the interior journey than the provinces provided. The stimulus of a place where the cultural and intellectual life of the new order is being assembled and debated and refined, where the questions that the new order is asking about what excellence looks like and how it should be cultivated and transmitted are being asked with a seriousness and a sophistication that the provinces cannot match. He engages with this intellectual life from his characteristic position of adjacency, close enough to participate and benefit from the participation, but never fully absorbed into the institutional frameworks that the participation takes place within. Always the person who brings something from outside the available categories, rather than the person who refines and extends the categories from within. The painters and the poets and the scholars he encounters in Edo respond to him with the specific mixture of respect and uncertainty that serious people in one discipline bring to a serious person from another discipline whose seriousness is unmistakable, but whose framework is not the framework they work within, and whose conclusions, where they are legible, do not always fit the conclusions that their own practice has led them to. They recognize the quality of his attention, recognize it in the paintings and the carvings, and the specific way he talks about the relationship between practice and principle. But they are not always sure what to do with the recognition, not always sure how to locate him within the available categories of serious practitioner, not always sure whether he is a martial artist who makes art, or an artist who was once a martial artist, or something else entirely, something that does not fit either category, because it was never organized around either category, but around the question that both categories are, in their different ways, in service of. He does not help them locate him. This is consistent with everything the life suggests about his relationship to categories and the institutions that produce them. The relationship of a person who has always been adjacent to the available frameworks rather than inside them, and who has found in the adjacency not discomfort, but the specific freedom of a person who is not required to defend any particular position because they have not committed to any particular position, who is free to follow the question wherever it leads, because the question, rather than any institutional affiliation, is what the life is organized around. The inner journey continues. The translation project continues. The work of finding language for the things the body knows continues, with the specific and patient quality of work that has accepted that it will take as long as it takes, and that the taking of time is not a failure of efficiency, but a requirement of honesty. That the language for genuine things arrives when it arrives, and cannot be hurried without being falsified. That the book that is eventually going to be written can only be written when the understanding it is trying to transmit is complete enough to be transmitted, and that the completeness requires the time the completeness requires. There is a specific quality of peace that arrives in a life that has been serious about its question for long enough. A quality that is different from the peace of resolution, different from the peace of a person who has found the answer and can now rest from the finding. It is the peace of a person who has made their terms with the question, who has accepted that the question will not be fully answered in the time available, and has found in that acceptance not defeat, but a kind of liberation. The liberation of no longer needing the answer to arrive before the living can be complete, of understanding that the living and the asking are the same thing, and that the completeness of the life is not a function of the completeness of the answer, but of the quality of attention brought to the asking. Musashi arrives at something like this peace in the later decades of the Middle Years, in the period between the end of the Musha Shugyo and the beginning of the cave. And the peace is visible in the work of this period, in the specific way that peace is visible in the work of serious practitioners. Not as softness, not as the relaxation of the commitment that produced the work, but as a quality of settledness, of a hand that is moving from a place that has stopped needing to prove anything, and has therefore become available for the pure and undefended expression of what it knows. The paintings of this period have this quality. The sumi-e, the ink-wash paintings, the shrike on a dead branch, and the hote with his sack, and the daruma staring at the wall. These images have the specific and recognizable quality of work that was made without the need to make something impressive, that was made simply because the making was the honest thing to do in the moment of making, that carries within it the trace of a quality of attention that was fully present for the work and fully absent from the question of what the work would mean to the people who saw it. He is becoming, in these years, the person who will be able to write the book. Not yet writing it, not yet at the cave above Kumamoto, where the writing will eventually happen, but becoming the person who has enough of the understanding in articulate form, enough of the translation project completed, enough of the body's knowledge converted into language that can be transmitted to people who were not there for the 60 duels, and the road, and the island, and the decades of interior work that followed. The book is still years away, still requiring the accumulation of more experience and more reflection, and the specific and clarifying pressure of age and proximity to the end that makes the transmission project urgent in a way that the middle years, with their sense of time still available, could not make it. But the direction is clear. The interior journey has a destination now, not a geographic destination, not a place on a map, but the destination that all serious interior journeys have, which is the place where the understanding is complete enough to be given away, where the translation is faithful enough to be trusted, where the language that has been sought for decades is finally adequate to the thing it is trying to say. That destination is ahead, in the mountains above a city in Kyushu, in a cave where the air is cool and the rock is damp, and the sound of water comes from somewhere below, in the last weeks of a long and various and entirely serious life. But not yet. For now there is the road that is no longer the Musha Shugyo, but is still the road. The studio and the carving block and the brush and the slow and patient work of a person who has stopped fighting and started listening, who has turned the quality of attention that won 60 duels inward, and is finding there a territory as large and as honest and as demanding as any opponent he ever faced. Shh. Just breathe. The pilgrimage is over. The interior journey has no end point that can be seen from here, and the man walking it is still walking, still asking, still bringing to the question the same quality of presence that he brought to the field at the edge of the village in Harima when he was young, and the world was still deciding what to do with him. Some things do not change. Good night.
The ink is prepared before the painting begins. This is not a preliminary, not a prelude, not the functional but unimportant step that precedes the real work. The preparation of the ink is the beginning of the work, the first movement of the practice, the moment at which the quality of attention that the painting requires is either present or not present. And everything that follows will carry the trace of whether it was present here, at the beginning, before the brush has touched the paper and the image has begun to emerge from the specific and responsive darkness of ink on a receiving surface. The inkstone is cold under the hand. This is the first sensation, the specific and grounding coolness of the stone that has been sitting in the room through the night and has taken on the temperature of the air, the temperature of a room in the early morning, before the body's presence has begun to warm it. The ink stick moves against the wet surface of the stone with a sound that is almost nothing, almost below the threshold of what the ear registers as sound, a soft and rhythmic friction that is less heard than felt, that travels up through the hand and the wrist and the forearm with the specific and subtle vibration of a material being transformed by steady pressure into something it was not before. Shh. The ink stick moves. The water darkens. The smell rises. The specific and not entirely describable smell of ink being made, which is the smell of something ancient and the smell of something immediate simultaneously. The smell of 10,000 years of human hands making this same movement on this same kind of stone, producing this same darkness that will leave behind it, on whatever surface receives it, the specific and irreversible record of the attention that guided it. He grinds slowly. Not because slow is better than fast in any technical sense, not because the ink requires a particular pace to achieve the consistency the work needs, but because the grinding is the calibration, is the specific and physical practice of bringing the quality of attention to the level the work requires, of moving from the ordinary scattered quality of a mind that has been doing other things into the organized and present quality of a mind that is fully here, fully available, not reaching toward the image that will be made, or reviewing the images that have been made before, but simply present to the stone and the stick and the darkening water, and the sound that is almost no sound at all, the sound of material becoming what the work needs it to be. The paper is laid out on the low table. It is washi, Japanese paper, made from the inner bark of the kozo tree, and its surface has a quality that Western paper does not have, a quality of slight irregularity, of a surface that is not perfectly smooth, but has a texture, a grain, a specific and readable topography that the brush will feel as it moves across it, that will influence the movement in ways that are not entirely predictable and not entirely controllable, that require the brush to respond to the paper as well as to the intention of the hand, that make the painting a conversation between the person and the material, rather than a unilateral imposition of the person's vision onto a passive surface. The paper receives the light in the room with a quality of luminescence that the ink will darken and the darkness will make visible, the way silence makes sound visible by providing the ground against which the sound can be heard. He sits before the paper for a moment before the brush moves. This sitting, this specific and deliberate pause before the beginning, is not hesitation, is not the uncertainty of a person who does not know what they are about to do, is the same pause that the serious practitioner takes before the engagement, the moment of complete stillness that precedes complete movement,
the gathering of everything the practice has given into the specific and organized readiness that the work requires. The room is quiet. The ink is ready. The paper is waiting with the patient and indifferent readiness of a material that has no investment in what will be made on its surface, but that will receive honestly whatever is brought to it. The brush lifts. The first stroke lands on the paper with a sound that is the sound of complete commitment. Not loud, not dramatic, not the sound of force being applied to a resistant surface, but the specific and confident sound of a brush that is moving from the center of the hand rather than the tips of the fingers, that is guided by the whole arm rather than the wrist alone, that carries in its movement the organized weight of a body that is fully behind what the hand is doing, rather than a hand that is working while the body waits. The sound is closer to that than to anything else available in the vocabulary of onomatopoeia. The specific and soft percussion of bristles meeting paper with the confidence of a movement that knows where it is going and goes there without the hesitation that produces the tentative line, the line that asks permission from the surface rather than meeting it as an equal. The stroke extends across the paper in the way that a sword stroke extends through space, not stopping at the point of contact, but continuing through it. The energy of the movement not terminating at the surface, but passing through the surface. The brush moving as if the paper were not the end of the stroke, but a point along the stroke's natural path. The same principle that makes the sword cut rather than strike, that makes the blade pass through rather than into. He learned this from the sword, and he is using it now with the brush, and the translation is so complete, so entirely absorbed into the body's understanding of how force and material and intention interact, that the connection between the two movements is not a thought, but a fact. Not a principle being applied, but a practice being continued in a different medium with a different instrument, producing a different but related kind of evidence of the same underlying thing. The image that is emerging on the paper is a shrike on a dead branch. This is one of the subjects he returns to across the years of the painting practice, one of the images that the brush finds again and again in the way that serious practitioners return to the subjects that are most honest for them, that most directly express whatever it is the practice is trying to say. The shrike is a small bird and a predator, a combination that the natural world produces with a matter-of-factness that human moral sensibility finds slightly unsettling. A creature that kills with the efficiency and the complete absence of excess that Musashi has been studying in himself and in others for 60 years. The dead branch is the specific and entirely honest ground against which the bird's aliveness is visible, the stillness that makes the potential movement legible, the way silence makes sound legible. The brush moves in short, decisive strokes for the bird, and in a single, long, controlled stroke for the branch. The difference in the quality of movement producing the difference in the quality of line that the image requires. The bird built from accumulation, and the branch built from commitment. The two techniques producing on the same surface the two qualities of presence that together make the image what it is. Scratch. The short strokes for the bird's body have a quality of sound that is different from the quality of the long stroke. A slightly rougher contact between bristle and paper as the brush changes direction rapidly. the sound of attention that is making many small decisions quickly, rather than one large decision slowly. Shh. The long stroke for the branch is almost silent. The brush moving across the paper with the specific and unhurried confidence of a line that knows exactly where it is going, and is going there without asking the surface for permission. He does not think about the shrike while he is painting the shrike. This is the principle that all the years of the practice have been moving toward. The principle that the best work is produced in the condition of not thinking about, of the attention being so fully organized around the movement that the movement and the attention are the same thing, that there is no gap between the intention and the execution, no space in which the self can insert itself between the question and the answer and complicate the answer with the self's various preferences and fears and habitual tendencies. The shrike appears on the paper not because Musashi is thinking about shrikes, but because the brush is moving from the place in the practice where shrikes live, from the accumulated understanding of what a shrike is and what it means, and what the branch beneath it means, and what the relationship between the two means. An understanding that lives in the body rather than the mind, and that the mind, when it is quiet enough, can allow the body to express without interference. The sculpture is different from the painting in the specific ways that irreversibility is different from revisability, that the removal of material is different from the application of material, that the thing being uncovered is different from the thing being built. He works in wood mostly, in the specific and various Japanese woods, whose different qualities of grain and hardness and responsiveness to the blade require different qualities of approach, different relationships between the force of the cut and the angle of the blade, and the specific and honest reading of what the wood will accept and what it will resist, and what the resistance means about the nature of the wood and the nature of what is trying to be made. The carving tool moves through the wood with a sound that is one of the most honest sounds available to a person who is working seriously with their hands. Tsk. The blade entering the grain at the correct angle, the wood separating cleanly along the line of its own structure, the cut that goes with the material rather than against it, that finds the path of least resistance, that is also the path of greatest integrity, that removes what needs to be removed without disturbing what needs to remain. This sound, clean and short and entirely without echo, is the sound of tool and material in agreement, of a cut that is happening at the right place, in the right direction, with the right quality of force. When the cut is wrong, the sound changes, becomes duller, more resistant, carries in its quality the specific and honest feedback of a material that is being asked to do something it does not want to do, that is separating along the wrong line, that is telling the hand that the approach needs to change. He listens to the sound the way he listened to the feedback of the engagement, with the complete and organized attention of a person for whom the feedback is information rather than judgment, data rather than verdict, something to be understood and responded to rather than something to be accepted or resisted based on whether it confirms or contradicts what the hand was trying to do. The tool moves across the surface of the wood in the specific rhythm of a person who is reading the material as they work it, whose pace is set not by a predetermined idea of how fast the work should go, but by the pace that the wood and the tool and the quality of attention currently available to the hand together produce. The figure that is emerging from the block of wood is a Kanzan, the eccentric Tang dynasty poet who lived in a cave and wrote poems on rocks and trees, and was either a madman or an enlightened being, depending on who you asked and when. Musashi has been thinking about Kanzan for years, or rather, has been returning to Kanzan the way you return to people whose way of being in the world is relevant to your own questions, whose specific and various eccentricity illuminates something about the relationship between serious practice and the structures that serious practice tends to put the practitioner outside of. Kanzan in the cave, writing poems on surfaces that cannot hold them permanently, is a kind of answer to a question that Musashi has been living alongside for decades. The question of what it means to make things seriously when the making is not organized around the permanence of what is made, or the recognition of the person who made it, but around the quality of attention brought to the making. The figure emerges from the wood slowly, across sessions that are separated by days and sometimes weeks, the work returning to the block each time with fresh attention, finding in the fresh attention a clarity about what the figure needs that the accumulated attention of continuous work does not always provide. The face is the last thing and the hardest thing, the specific and particular quality of Kanzan's expression, which, in the surviving representations, is the expression of a person who is simultaneously completely present and completely elsewhere, who is looking at you and looking through you, and looking at something beyond both of you that only he can see. Musashi works on this expression with the specific and patient quality of a person who knows that the face will be right when it is right, and that trying to make it right by effort rather than by presence will produce something that is technically accomplished and emotionally absent, something that has the correct features without the correct life. The garden is the longest conversation, longer than any painting, longer than any carving, longer than any duel. The garden is the practice that extends across seasons and years, that requires the practitioner to work with a material that is not static, that changes between sessions, not because it has been worked, but because it has been living, that grows and dies and grows again according to its own logic and its own schedule, that will not hold the shape that was imposed on it last season without the ongoing negotiation of maintenance and revision, and the specific and patient acceptance that the garden has its own intentions, and that the best the gardener can do is understand those intentions clearly enough to work with them rather than against them. He designs a garden during his time in the service of the Hosokawa domain in Kumamoto, and the garden is still there, or something that descends from the garden he made is still there, and people who visit it and know what they are looking at find in it the same quality that the people who faced him in the duels found, and the people who look at the paintings find: the quality of economy, of the stone that is placed exactly where it needs to be placed, and the path that goes exactly where it needs to go, of a composition that has removed everything that is not essential, and has found in the essentials a completeness that the non-essential would only have diluted. The placement of a stone in a garden has a sound that is nothing like the sound of a sword stroke or a brush stroke, and is also, at the level of principle, exactly like both. The stone is heavy, and the setting of it into the earth is a committed and irreversible act. The weight of the stone pressing into the ground with a sound that is partly felt and partly heard. The specific and grounding thud of something substantial finding its place. of mass and earth, coming into the relationship that they will maintain for as long as the garden is tended, and longer. Thud. The stone settles. The sound completes itself in the body before it completes itself in the air. The vibration travelling up through the ground and through the knees of the person who placed it, and registering in the chest with the specific and satisfying quality of a thing done that needed doing, of an action completed that cannot be undone, and that is, now that it is complete, correct. The correctness of the placement is not something that can be calculated in advance, not something that a plan drawn on paper can fully determine, because the garden is a living system, and the stone's relationship to the other elements of the system, to the moss and the water and the other stones, and the specific quality of light that arrives at different angles through the seasons, is a relationship that can only be fully understood in the presence of all the elements simultaneously, that requires the eye and the body and the specific quality of attention that the practice has been developing for decades to be present in the garden at the moment of placement, and to read the system as it is, rather than as it was planned to be. This is the same skill that the duels required, the skill of reading the actual situation rather than the anticipated situation, of responding to what is present rather than what was expected, of allowing the quality of attention to override the plan when the plan and the present moment are in conflict. The garden teaches him something that the painting and the carving do not teach, or teaches it differently, with a different emphasis. The painting and the carving are complete when they are complete, are finished in a way that the finishing makes final, that closes the conversation between the practitioner and the material. The garden is never finished, is complete in each moment, and in the next moment requires attention again, is a practice that has no terminal point, but only the ongoing and seasonally varying relationship between the gardener and the growing things, and the stones, and the water, and the light. This ongoing quality, the specific and demanding continuity of a practice that does not allow for the completion that painting and carving allow, teaches something about the nature of practice itself, about the difference between mastery as a state achieved and mastery as a quality of ongoing engagement, about the practitioner who has arrived and the practitioner who is always arriving. The iron of the chapter's title is not the iron of the sword, though the sword is where the iron begins. It is the iron of the discipline, the specific and foundational quality of committed practice that underlies the painting and the carving and the garden and the sword and every other instrument through which the question has been pursued across the decades of the life. The iron that is not in the tool, but in the person who holds the tool, that was forged in the field at the edge of a village in Harima, before the person holding it understood what was being forged, or why. He is in his 50s now, and the work has the specific quality of work produced by a person in their 50s who has been serious about their practice since childhood, which is to say, it has the quality of deep familiarity combined with ongoing discovery, of a person who knows the territory well enough to navigate it without effort, and who still, in the territory they know best, finds things they have not seen before. The paintings of this period are different from the paintings of the earlier period, in ways that the eye can detect without always being able to name, more settled and also more open, more completely themselves, and also more receptive to the specific and uncontrollable quality of the moment in which they were made. Less organized around demonstrating anything, and more organized around simply being present for whatever the brush and the paper and the quality of light in the room on that particular morning produce when they are brought together in the company of a person who is fully available to the encounter. The brush moves across the paper in the morning light, with the sound that has become over the decades the most familiar sound in his daily life. More familiar than the sound of voices, more familiar than the sound of the road, more familiar than the sound of the sword, which has been largely quiet now for years. Shh. The long stroke. Scratch, scratch. The short strokes for texture and detail. The sound of the brush being recharged with ink. The specific soft pressure of bristles against the inkstone surface as the excess ink is removed and the brush is shaped for the next movement. These sounds, in their daily and unhurried sequence, are the sounds of the second half of the life. The sounds of the interior journey being conducted with the same seriousness and the same quality of attention that the exterior journey was conducted with, producing in the visible record of the paintings and the sculptures and the garden the same quality of presence that the duels produced in their own very different and very visible way. The ink and the iron are the same thing. This is what the chapter has been circling toward, the specific and clarifying recognition that arrives not as a thought, but as a fact, not as a conclusion the mind reaches, but as a truth the body has always known, and that the mind, having spent decades learning to listen to the body, can now receive and hold without distortion. The discipline that made the sword what it was is the discipline that makes the brush what it is. The iron quality of complete and organized presence that expresses itself differently in different materials, but is recognizably the same quality in all of them. The same voice in different registers. The same fire burning at different temperatures in different contexts, but drawing on the same source. The source that was built in the field in Harima and confirmed on the plain of Sekigahara and sharpened across 60 duels, and is now, in the quiet mornings of the later decades, being expressed in the most honest language currently available to it, which is the language of ink on paper and chisel on wood and stone in earth, and the specific and irreplaceable quality of a person who has been asking the same question for 50 years, and is still, every morning, at the beginning. The brush completes the stroke. The sound disappears into the silence of the room, the way all sounds disappear into the silence that surrounds them. The shrike sits on the dead branch on the paper and looks out at the room with the specific and unreadable expression of a creature that is entirely what it is, and nothing else. And the man who painted it sits before the paper in the morning light, with the ink-stained hand, and the quality of stillness that is not the absence of presence, but its fullest expression. Shh. Just breathe. The brush is still. The ink is drying on the paper with the specific and unhurried patience of something that has already done what it came to do. Let that be enough. Let everything be enough. Good night. The road to Kumamoto is the last road. Not the last road in the sense of the road that ends in death. Not yet. Not quite yet. But the last road in the sense of the road that ends in the place where the remaining life will be lived. The road that arrives somewhere and does not depart again. That brings the traveller to the specific and final geography of the years that are left, and leaves them there with the specific and clarifying knowledge that this is the place, that the movement which has characterized the life since the boy walked out of the valley between the mountains that do not care about each other is completing itself here, in this city, in the service of this Lord, in the mountains above this valley where a cave waits with the patient and entirely indifferent readiness of stone that has been waiting for longer than any human project, and will continue waiting long after the human project that briefly occupied it is complete. Hosokawa Tadatoshi invites him to Kumamoto in 1640, and the invitation is the kind of invitation that a lord of Tadatoshi's standing and seriousness extends to a person of Musashi's standing and seriousness, which is to say, it is less an invitation than a recognition, a formal acknowledgement by the institutional world that the person it is acknowledging has arrived at something that the institution wants to be associated with, that the reputation and the work and the specific quality of presence that Miyamoto Musashi carries have become something that the Hosokawa domain wants within its borders. Not as a weapon, not primarily as a martial resource in the way that the lords of the earlier period sought out serious practitioners as military assets, but as something closer to what a later period would call a cultural treasure, a living embodiment of a quality of seriousness and excellence that the domain wants to claim as part of its own identity. Musashi accepts. The acceptance is not a concession, not the surrender of the independence that has characterized the entire life, not the final absorption into the institutional framework that the life has always moved adjacent to rather than inside. It is something more nuanced than acceptance or rejection, something closer to the recognition that the time for adjacency has served its purpose, and that the final chapter of the life, the chapter that the interior journey has been building toward, requires a stability and a continuity that the road cannot provide, requires the specific and sustaining conditions of a place that is known and a situation that is settled, requires the quiet that can only be fully quiet when the question of where to go next has been answered well enough that it no longer takes up any of the available attention. Kumamoto receives him with the specific quality of a city that is still being made, that is in the active process of becoming what it will be, that has the energy of construction and establishment, rather than the settled energy of a place that has already decided what it is. The castle is substantial, the domain is prosperous, the lord is serious, and genuinely interested in the range of things that Musashi represents. Not merely the martial history, but the paintings and the philosophy and the specific quality of mind that has produced both. The relationship between them is one of the better relationships in the historical record between a lord and a person of Musashi's kind, organized around genuine mutual respect, rather than the more transactional arrangements that typically define the relationship between patrons and practitioners in this period. He settles into the life of the domain with the ease of a person who has been on the road long enough that settlement, when it finally comes, does not feel like confinement, but like arrival, like the specific and grounding quality of a place that has stopped moving, and can now be inhabited rather than merely passed through. He teaches, he paints, he carves, he tends the garden that he is making in the domain. He participates in the cultural and intellectual life of a court that takes these things seriously. And in the mountains above the city, a few miles from the castle and the court and the specific noise of institutional life, there is a cave in the rock face of a volcanic formation that the locals call Reigando, the cave of the spirit rock. And the cave is there, waiting, the way the last things wait, which is to say, without urgency and without impatience, and with the complete and settled certainty of something that knows it will be found when the time is right. The path to Reigando goes up through the cedar forest above the city, through the specific and changing quality of light that the cedar canopy produces as the path ascends, the light thickening and cooling as the trees close in and the angle of the slope increases, the air acquiring the specific and compound quality of air in a Japanese cedar forest in the early morning, which is the quality of coolness and moisture and the faint resinous smell of the cedar itself, layered over the deeper and older smell of the volcanic soil that the trees grow in. A smell that is not quite earth and not quite mineral, but something that partakes of both, something that carries in it the specific and unnameable quality of a landscape that was made by processes older and larger than any human category. The sound changes as the path rises. The sounds of the city, the specific and various noise of a place where people live and work and move through their days, fall away, not suddenly, but gradually, replaced first by the sounds of the forest, the birds and the wind in the upper branches, and the specific and irregular percussion of a woodpecker somewhere in the middle distance. And then, as the path goes higher and the forest closes more completely around it, by something closer to silence, the specific and not quite complete silence of a forest that is full of small sounds, but in which no human voice is present, in which the auditory texture is entirely non-human, and therefore carries a quality of peace that human sound, however pleasant, cannot carry. Because human sound always carries with it the implicit demand of attention, the social requirement of response that even the most benign human presence generates. The cave opens in the rock face above the forest line with the specific and unremarkable quality of geological features that have no awareness of their own significance, that simply exist in the way that stone exists, without the self-consciousness that significance tends to produce in human things. The entrance is not dramatic, is not framed by the kind of natural grandeur that the imagination wants to supply to a place where something important happened, is simply an opening in the rock, roughly arched by the irregular geometry of the volcanic formation, wide enough for a person to enter without difficulty, and deep enough that the interior extends beyond what the eye can see from the entrance, when the light outside is bright and the interior is dark. He enters the cave for the first time, not to write, but simply to be there, to understand what the place is and what it offers, and whether it is the right place for the thing that the interior journey has been building toward for 30 years. The air inside is immediately and unmistakably different from the air outside, cooler by several degrees, with a quality of stillness that outdoor air does not have, because outdoor air is always moving, always being displaced by wind or thermal activity, or the movement of living things through it. and the air inside the cave is not moving, has not been moving, is the specific and unchanging air of an enclosed space whose temperature and humidity have reached an equilibrium that the small fluctuations of the outside world cannot disturb. The smell of the cave is the smell of wet stone, and the specific mineral quality of volcanic rock, and the faint and ancient smell of the earth above, coming through the porous stone in a way that is too subtle to be identified precisely, but that is present, unmistakably present, as a quality of the air rather than a specific scent, a quality that is the olfactory equivalent of the specific and grounding visual quality of stone, the quality of something that has been here for a very long time and will be here for a very long time after, and that is not indifferent to the human presence within it, but simply larger than it, organized around a different scale of time, in which the human presence is a brief and not particularly significant event. The sound of water comes from somewhere below. This is the detail about Reigando that everyone who has written about it returns to eventually, because it is the detail that the imagination finds most resonant, most expressive of the quality of the place, as a location for the specific and interior work that Musashi will do here. The water is not visible, is not accessible, is simply audible, a sound that comes through the rock from somewhere beneath the cave floor, a small and steady sound that is neither loud enough to be intrusive nor quiet enough to be absent, that provides, within the cave's silence, the specific and sustaining quality of something living and moving in the darkness below, something that has been moving for longer than any human project, and will continue moving when the human project is complete. Tok, tok. The water finds its way through the rock in the specific and unhurried manner of water moving through stone, each drop falling from one level to the next, with the soft and irregular percussion of a sound that is not trying to be heard, but that the stillness of the cave makes audible anyway, that the absence of other sounds elevates from background to presence, from the texture of the place to one of its defining qualities. He sits in the cave and listens to the water for a long time, the first time he enters, and then on subsequent visits, sitting in the specific quality of attention that the cave seems to produce naturally, or that the cave seems to make available to a person who arrives with the right quality of readiness, the attention that is not directed at anything in particular, but is simply open, simply present, simply here in the way that the water below is here, moving without destination through the darkness with the patient and unhurried quality of something that has accepted its own nature completely. The cave becomes a practice in these years before the writing begins, a place he comes to not to do anything, but to be somewhere, to spend time in the specific and clarifying quality of a space that is removed from the noise and the demand and the social complexity of the court and the city and the various institutional structures that the life in Kumamoto's service inevitably involves. The cave is not part of the institution, is not owned by the domain or maintained by the domain, or included in any of the formal arrangements that define his relationship to the Hosokawa family. It is simply there, in the mountains above the city, available to anyone who makes the walk up through the cedar forest, but in practice, available only to the people who know it is there, and who have the specific quality of relationship to solitude that a cave offers, rather than the quality of relationship to solitude that a room or a garden offers, which is the relationship of a person who is comfortable in the dark and in the cold, and in the specific and slightly vertiginous quality of a space that is enclosed by stone rather than by human construction. He is comfortable in all of these things. The dark and the cold and the stone are not conditions that require adjustment or tolerance, are not discomforts to be endured in the service of something that makes the endurance worthwhile, but simply the qualities of the place, received as the place is received, with the same quality of acceptance that the practice has been teaching for 60 years. The acceptance that does not mean passive reception of whatever is present, but active and complete engagement with the actual conditions of the actual situation. The engagement that begins with seeing clearly what is there, rather than what was hoped for or expected. Hosokawa Padatoshi dies in 1641, 1 year after Musashi's arrival in Kumamoto. The death is a loss, a genuine and specific loss. The loss of a patron who was also, in the limited but real way that the relationship between lord and practitioner allows, a person whose company was valued and whose seriousness was respected. The new arrangements that follow the death are not hostile to Musashi's presence in the domain, but they are different, carry a different quality of engagement, and the difference, however manageable, adds to the specific and gradually increasing quality of the later years that might be called withdrawal, the slow and not unhappy process of a person whose ties to the institutional world are becoming less various and less demanding, who is moving with the patient and deliberate quality of a person who has accepted the direction without hurrying the arrival toward the cave. The decision to begin writing is not recorded as a decision in the surviving accounts, which is appropriate, because by the time the writing begins, it is not really a decision anymore, but the next thing, the thing that the interior journey has been building toward for 30 years, and that arrives not as a choice between alternatives, but as the recognition that the time is right, that the understanding is complete enough, that the translation project has reached the point where the language is adequate to the thing it is trying to say, and the remaining life is the right length for the saying of it. He is in his late 50s, or perhaps 60, when the writing begins in earnest. The body carries the decades with the specific and honest weight that bodies carry 6 decades of serious use. The joints speaking more clearly than they did at 40. The specific quality of physical energy that the duels required no longer available in the form it was once available in. The body moving with a deliberateness that is not slowness exactly, but the specific quality of movement that belongs to a person who has stopped taking movement for granted, and has begun to bring to each physical act the quality of attention that the practice has always reserved for the most significant acts. This is not a diminishment, or not only a diminishment. There is something in the body's increased deliberateness that produces a quality of presence in physical acts that the unconscious ease of the younger body could not produce. A quality of being entirely here for each movement, because each movement requires the full acknowledgement of the body, rather than the body's automatic and unreflective execution. The brush and the paper are brought to the cave. This is the specific and practical fact of the writing, that the instrument and the material of the painting practice are now also the instrument and the material of the philosophical project, that the same brush that has been making images for decades is now making language, that the hand that learned to speak through images is now being asked to speak through words, and is finding, to the hand's own slight surprise, that the speaking through words requires the same quality of movement as the speaking through images, the same relationship between intention and execution, the same commitment to the stroke that does not hedge, that goes where it needs to go without the hesitation that produces the tentative line. The cave in the early morning has a quality of light that no other location in his experience has had. The light enters from the entrance at a low angle, the specific angle of early morning light at this latitude in this season, and it illuminates the interior not fully, but partially, creating within the cave a gradient between the lit and the unlit that makes the interior feel larger than its physical dimensions, that gives the space a quality of depth that is partly optical and partly something else, something that the quality of the silence and the sound of the water and the specific and mineral smell of the wet stone all contribute to. A quality of interiority that is not the interiority of a room, but the interiority of the earth itself. The specific and ancient quality of being inside something that has been here since before the human world began, and will be here after it ends. He sits in this light with the brush and the paper, and begins. The first words of the Gorin no Sho, the Book of Five Rings, are not the words of a person announcing themselves, or establishing their credentials, or providing the kind of contextual framing that academic writing requires before it gets to the substance. They are the words of a person who has been waiting a long time to say something specific, and who now, with the time available and the understanding complete, and the cave providing the specific and clarifying quality of silence that the saying requires, simply begins to say it. The brush moves across the paper with the sound that has been the soundtrack of the mornings for decades. Shh. The first stroke, and then the next, and then the next. The writing moves slowly, and not because the writer is uncertain, but because the writer is careful. Because the specific and demanding quality of the translation project, of finding the language that is adequate to the thing being described without adding to it or subtracting from it, requires the pace that honesty requires, rather than the pace that urgency would prefer. Each sentence is tested against the experience it is trying to describe, held up against the 60 years of practice and engagement and interior journey, and checked for accuracy in the way that the carving tool is checked against the grain of the wood, with the specific and patient attention of a person who understands that the gap between what is said and what is true is not a failure of language, but a failure of attention. That the right language exists for every true thing, and that the finding of it requires the same quality of presence that every other serious practice requires. The cave holds the writing the way it holds everything, which is without judgment and without preference, with the complete and patient availability of stone that has been providing shelter for longer than any human project, and that has no investment in the quality of what is produced within it. The water sounds below. Tok, tok. The irregular and patient percussion of water finding its way through rock. The sound that has been present in the cave since before the path through the cedar forest was made, and will be present after the path returns to forest, and the forest returns to whatever the forest returns to, when the human things that shaped it have been gone long enough. The sound is the constant of the writing, the background against which the scratch of the brush on paper, and the occasional silence of a person who has stopped writing to look at what has been written, and to test it against the thing it is trying to say, are the variable elements, the sounds of a specific and individual human project, being conducted in the company of a sound that is indifferent to all specific and individual human projects, and that provides, by its indifference, a kind of honesty that human company cannot provide. He writes about the way of the sword, and the way of the sword turns out, under the pressure of the writing, to be a way of something larger than the sword, a way of complete and organized engagement with whatever the practice requires, a way of the quality of attention that the sword was the first instrument for developing, and that every subsequent instrument has continued to develop in its different register. The 5 rings, earth and water and fire and wind and void, are not categories of sword technique, are not a taxonomy of combat situations, or a classification of opponent types, are 5 dimensions of the same practice, 5 aspects of the relationship between a person and the complete and honest engagement with what the moment requires. 5 windows into the same room that the practice has been inhabiting since the field in Harima. The writing happens across the last years of the life with the specific and unhurried quality of work that knows it has enough time, but not unlimited time, that is moving at the pace the honesty requires, without the luxury of the pace that unlimited time would allow. He is not well in these final years, the body carrying its 60 years with a weight that is becoming less negotiable, less amenable to the quality of sustained physical practice that the earlier decades allowed, more honest about its own limits in the specific and daily way that aging bodies are honest about their limits, which is to say, through the language of pain and fatigue, and the specific and gradually increasing gap between what the will intends and what the body can execute. The gap does not disturb him, or it disturbs him, and he receives the disturbance with the same quality of acceptance that the practice has been teaching for 60 years. The acceptance that does not mean the absence of feeling, but the absence of resistance to feeling. The willingness to be where he is, rather than where he would prefer to be. To work with the body that is present, rather than the body that was present 30 years ago. To bring to the diminished instrument the same quality of attention that was brought to the full instrument, and to find, as the practice has always found, that the quality of the attention matters more than the condition of the instrument, that the work produced by a person of 60 with a serious practice is different from the work produced by a person of 30 with the same practice, but is not necessarily less, is not necessarily smaller or less honest, or less completely itself, is simply the work of a different moment in the same long conversation. The cave is cool in the evenings when the light has gone from the entrance, and the interior is lit only by the small lamp that he works by, the flame moving in the slight and barely perceptible air movement that the cave's ventilation produces, casting the specific and variable light of flame across the paper and the brush, and the ink-stained hand moving across the surface, with the careful and deliberate quality of a person who is making something that needs to last, that is being made for the people who will come after, for the boardrooms and the training floors and the quiet corners of lives that have not yet begun, for the specific and various ways that people 500 years from now will find in the words being written in this cave by this lamplight in this year what they need to find. Shh. Just breathe. The cave is quiet around you. The water sounds below, patient and steady, the sound of something that has always been here and will always be here. The lamp flame moves in the slight and barely perceptible breath of the cave, and somewhere in the pool of light it casts, a brush is moving across paper with the careful and deliberate quality of a person who has something to say and the time, just barely the time, to say it. Good night. The book is finished in the spring of 1645, or close enough to finished, that the distinction between finished and complete does not matter in the way that it would matter for a book that had more time available to it, that could be returned to and refined and reconsidered with the specific luxury of a writer who has years ahead in which the refinement can continue. This book does not have years ahead. The person who wrote it has weeks, or perhaps days, the specific and narrowing horizon of a body that has been carrying its 60 years with increasing difficulty, and that is now, in the spring of this year, in this cave, above this city, approaching the end of what it can carry, with the specific and honest quality of a body that does not dramatize its own condition, but simply reports it, through the language of pain and fatigue, and the specific and daily diminishment of what the will can ask and receive from the instrument that the will has been working with for 6 decades. He writes the final sections of the Gorin no Sho in the cave at Reigando, with the brush moving more slowly than it moved in the earlier sections, not because the understanding has become less clear, but because the hand has become less reliable, because the gap between intention and execution that the body's condition is producing requires more attention to navigate than it required in the earlier sessions, requires the specific and patient quality of a person who is working with an instrument that is no longer fully responsive, and who is choosing, in response to this, to slow down rather than to push through, to give the instrument what the instrument needs rather than what the project would prefer. The slowing is itself a kind of teaching, a demonstration within the act of writing the book of the principle the book is trying to transmit, the principle of working with the actual conditions of the actual situation rather than the conditions that would be preferred. The final ring is the ring of void, ku, emptiness, and it is the shortest section of the book and the hardest to write and the hardest to read and the most important, the section that the previous 4 rings have been building toward, that the earth and the water and the fire and the wind have all been preparing the reader to receive. The void is not nothingness, is not the absence of the other 4 rings, but their completion, the condition that exists when the practice has been pursued so completely and so honestly that the practitioner is no longer separate from the practice, when the self that was doing the doing has become so transparent to the doing that the distinction between the doer and the done has dissolved into something that is neither and both, that is simply the practice happening, the sword moving, the brush moving, the attention moving through whatever the moment requires, with the complete and organized presence of something that has stopped needing to know that it is present. He has been in this condition, or in the vicinity of this condition, in the specific and unrepeatable moments of the duels and the paintings and the carvings and the garden. The moments when the practice was so fully operational that the self was not available to observe it, when the movement happened from a place that was below or beyond the conscious direction of the mind, from the place that the body knows and the mind can only point toward and describe approximately, and hope that the description is honest enough to help the reader find their own way there. These moments are what the book is trying to transmit, or rather, these moments are what the book is trying to make available, to give the reader not the moments themselves, but the path toward the conditions that make the moments possible, the conditions of practice and attention, and the specific and demanding commitment to honesty that is the only reliable route to the place where the moments can happen. The brush completes the final character of the final section. The sound of the completion is the sound of the brush lifting from the paper after the last stroke, a sound that is almost nothing, almost below the threshold of what can be called a sound. The specific and barely perceptible whisper of bristles separating from the surface they have been in contact with for the duration of the stroke. And then silence. The silence that follows the completion of something that has been going on for a long time is different from ordinary silence in the way that the silence after music ends is different from silence that precedes music, shaped by what just ended, carrying within it the specific contours of the thing that is no longer happening, the silence of a completed thing rather than the silence of a thing not yet begun. The book is given to Terao Maganoja, his most trusted student, 2 weeks before the end. This transmission, the specific and deliberate act of placing the completed manuscript in the hands of the person who will carry it forward, is one of the most significant moments in the entire Musashi story, and one of the least dramatic, because it happens not in the cave, and not in any location that the legend would choose for a climactic scene, but simply in the place where Musashi is at the time, lying down, the body having made its final determination about what it can and cannot do, and the transmission happening with the specific and matter-of-fact quality of a person who is doing what needs to be done while the doing is still possible. Terao Maganojo has been with him for years, has been one of the students who genuinely learned rather than merely trained, who understood that what was being transmitted was a question rather than a system, and who proved his understanding through the specific and patient way he engaged with the question over the years of the relationship, bringing to it the quality of seriousness that serious transmission requires, and receiving in return not a technique, but a way of engaging with the practice that was entirely his own and entirely derived from what the teacher had made available. He receives the manuscript with the specific quality of a person who understands the weight of what he is holding, who knows that the object in his hands is the translation of 60 years of serious practice into the language of words, and that the translation, however inadequate language always is to the things it tries to describe, is as honest and as complete as the life that produced it could make it. The weight of the manuscript is the weight of paper and ink, which is to say, it is almost nothing, which is to say, it is everything. The paper that Musashi used for the writing is the same washi paper that he used for the paintings, the same surface that received the shrike on the dead branch, and the hote with his sack, and the daruma staring at the wall. And the ink is the same ink that was ground on the same inkstone, in the same early mornings, in the same quality of light. The book is made of the same materials as the art, is, in a physical sense, indistinguishable from the paintings, except in the kind of marks that were made on it. And this physical continuity between the art and the philosophy is not accidental, is the honest expression of the principle that the book is trying to transmit, the principle that the sword and the brush and the carving tool and the garden and the words are all instruments of the same practice, and that the practice, wherever it is expressed and through whatever instrument it is expressed, leaves behind it the same kind of evidence, which is the evidence of complete and organized attention, the specific and readable trace of a person who was fully present for what they were doing. Maganojo takes the manuscript, and Musashi lies back in the specific and honest condition of a body that has done what it came to do, and is now in the process of completing itself in the only way that bodies complete themselves, with the patient and irreversible quality of a biological process that does not require the person's participation to proceed, but that the person, if they have been serious about their practice, can be present for in a way that makes the presence a continuation of the practice rather than a departure from it. He is present for his own dying, in the way that he was present for the duels and the paintings, and the carvings, and the garden, and the writing, with the specific and complete quality of attention that has been the signature of the life, the thing that was built in the field at the edge of the village in Harima, and that has been operating, in one form or another, ever since. 2 weeks. The accounts give us this specific and heartbreaking interval between the giving of the book and the end. 2 weeks in which the book exists in the world, and the person who wrote it also exists in the world. And the overlap between these two states of existence is measured in days that are not recorded in any particular detail, that the sources pass through with the specific and respectful brevity of accounts that understand that what is happening in these 2 weeks is private, in a way that the duels and the philosophy and the artistic practice were not private, that belongs to the person and to the people immediately present, rather than to the historical record, or the legend, or the 500 years of readers who will eventually carry the book into their own lives and find in it what they need to find. The book reaches the world gradually and then completely, in the specific way that important things reach the world, when the world is not yet ready to recognize their importance at the moment of their arrival. The Gorin no-show circulates initially among the students and the practitioners, and the people in the domain who have a direct connection to the person who wrote it, moves through the networks of the martial world in the way that serious texts move through serious communities, slowly and carefully, read by people who have the context to understand what they are reading, and the practice to know whether what they are reading is honest. The recognition comes slowly. This is not unusual for serious work, not a reflection of the work's quality or the world's failure to perceive quality, but simply the natural pace at which genuine understanding moves through a culture. The pace that requires not just the presence of the work, but the preparation of the reader, the development in the reader of the specific and various conditions that make the work fully available, that allow the reader to receive what the work is offering, rather than the simplified or distorted version of it that an unprepared reader produces by reading the work through the only categories currently available to them. The book eventually reaches readers who are not martial artists, not practitioners of any physical discipline related to the tradition in which it was written. Readers who come to it from the outside of its original context, and find within it something that speaks to their own practice and their own questions, with a directness and a clarity that the distance from the original context, rather than obscuring, seems to clarify. The boardrooms and the training floors and the quiet corners of lives that have nothing to do with 16th century Japanese sword practice find in the 5 rings something that is available to them, because the 5 rings are not, at the level at which they matter, about sword practice, are about the quality of attention and commitment and the relationship between a person and the complete and honest engagement with whatever the practice requires. And this is a subject with no historical or cultural limits, a subject that is as relevant in a room with fluorescent lights and a conference table as it is in a dojo or a cave above Kumamoto. He knew this, or something like this. The book was written for practitioners of the sword, and also for practitioners of everything else, written with the specific intention of transmitting not a technique, but a principle. And principles are not medium-specific, are not limited to the conditions of their discovery, are available to any person who brings to them the quality of attention that the principle requires, and who is willing to do the specific and demanding work of translating the principle from the form in which it was discovered into the form in which it is applicable to the conditions of their own practice. This translation, from the sword to whatever the reader's own equivalent of the sword is the work that the reader must do, the work that the book cannot do for the reader, but that the book makes possible by being honest enough about the principle to allow the translation to be made faithfully rather than approximately. The 500 years between the cave at Reigando and the present moment contain everything that has happened in the world since the spring of 1645. All of the history and the change, and the specific and various ways that human life has reorganized itself around new conditions and new questions, and new instruments for asking the questions that human life has always been asking. And through all of this, the book has been present, has been carried by people who found in it something they needed, has been translated into languages that did not exist when it was written, has been read in contexts that would have been unimaginable to the person who wrote it, has arrived in hands and minds and lives that had no connection to the tradition that produced it, and found there, in those distant and various and entirely unexpected places, the same recognition that the students who received it directly from Maganojo found, the recognition of something true and specific and entirely honest about the relationship between a person and the complete engagement with what matters to them. What did he want to leave behind? This is the question that the book and the paintings and the sculptures and the garden all answer in their different ways. And the answers are consistent enough across the different media and the different decades to constitute something like a reliable portrait of what the interior of the life was organized around, and what it hoped to transmit to the people who came after. He did not want to leave behind a record of victories, though the victories are part of the record, whether he wanted them to be or not, attached to the name in the way that significant outcomes attach to the names of the people who produced them, indelible, and not always perfectly accurate in the way that historical records are indelible and not always perfectly accurate. The victories are the evidence, not the point. He did not want to leave behind a school, a system, an institution that would transmit his technique to students who would transmit it to their students in the specific and gradually diluting chain of transmission that institutional knowledge follows. Each generation receiving a slightly less complete version of the original thing, because the original thing is not a technique that can be copied, but a quality of engagement that can only be developed through the specific and unglamorous work of direct practice. The schools that claim descent from him, the schools that have organized themselves around the name and the reputation and the various techniques that can be attributed to the practice, are real and in some cases serious, but they are not what he wanted to leave behind, or not the main thing, because the main thing is not transmissible through institutional inheritance, is not something that can be passed from teacher to student in the way that technique can be passed. What he wanted to leave behind was the question, not the answer, which cannot be given but only arrived at, and must be arrived at by each person through their own engagement with their own practice, in their own specific and unrepeatable conditions. The question, which is the question of what it means to bring the complete and organized quality of your full attention to whatever the practice requires, whatever the practice is, whatever the moment demands, without reservation and without the specific and comfortable hedging that partial engagement allows. This question is what the book transmits, is what the paintings transmit in their different register, is what the garden transmits in its different register, is what the 60 duels transmitted to the opponents who faced them and survived them and went away changed by the experience of having been fully present with someone who was more fully present than they were. The question is still alive. This is the fact that the 500 years of reading confirms. The fact that the book is still being carried into the corners of lives that need it, and still finding there the recognition that it found in the students who first received it. Still producing in readers who have never held a sword, and never will, the specific and clarifying quality of encountering something that is honest and complete and organized around a principle that the reader recognizes from their own experience, of what it feels like when the practice is operating at its fullest, and what it feels like when it is not. The question does not age, because the question is not about the specific conditions of 16th century Japan, or the specific practice of the sword, or the specific and various circumstances of the life that asked it. It is about something that is present in every life that takes its practice seriously, that is available in every moment of complete engagement with whatever the moment requires. He left behind the question, wrapped in a life that was the most complete available demonstration of what living the question looks like, across 60 years of various and serious engagement with it. The duels and the paintings, and the sculptures and the garden and the book are all the same thing at the level of principle. All evidence of the same quality of engagement. All answers to the same question, asked through different instruments, in different decades, under different conditions, all carrying the same specific and readable trace of a person who was fully present for what they were doing, and who left behind in the doing the kind of evidence that fully present people leave behind, which is the evidence that makes other people, 500 years later, stop and pay attention, and feel in the paying of attention something that they recognize as important and true, and somehow, despite the distance of centuries and cultures and conditions, directly and personally relevant to the specific and unrepeatable question of their own lives. The cave at Reigando is still there. The path through the cedar forest still goes up, through the changing quality of light, and the specific and compound smell of cedar and volcanic soil, and the gradually increasing quality of silence that the ascending path produces as the sounds of the city fall away, and the sounds of the forest take their place, and then the sounds of the forest give way to something closer, to the silence of the cave itself. The silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a quality of quiet that human noise, when it is absent, allows to be heard. The water still sounds below the cave floor, the same water, or the water that has replaced it, in the specific and continuous way that water replaces itself while remaining the same water. The same sound in the same place, producing the same quality of presence in the cave that it produced when the person who wrote the book sat above it in the early morning with the brush and the ink and the paper and the lamp. Tock, tock. The water finds its way through the rock with the patient and unhurried quality of water that has been finding its way through this rock since before the path was made, and will continue finding its way after the path has returned to forest. The sound is the most honest thing in the cave, the thing that has not changed and will not change, the thing that was here before the writing and will be here after the last person who read what was written has returned the book to the shelf, or put it down on the table, or closed it in the dark before sleep, with the specific and quiet quality of a person who has been given something they needed, and is now resting in the having of it.
The book is still being read, in languages that did not exist when it was written, in places that were unknown when it was written, in conditions that were unimaginable when it was written, by people whose lives have no connection to the tradition that produced it, and who find in it, nevertheless, the specific and clarifying quality of something that speaks directly to the question their own practice is asking. The boardroom and the dojo and the training floor and the quiet corner of the life where the person is trying to figure out what it means to do something with complete and total seriousness. These are the rooms where the book arrives and is recognized, where the 500-year distance between the cave and the present moment collapses into the specific and immediate quality of a text that is not historical, but present. Not about the past, but about the condition of being fully here for whatever the practice requires. Miyamoto Musashi died on the 19th day of the 5th month of the year 1645 in Kumamoto, in the service of the Hosokawa domain, having completed the book 2 weeks before, and having given it to the student who would carry it forward into the world that would eventually carry it everywhere. He was 60 years old, or 62, the records offering, as always, their range of options, their refusal to pin him down to a single number, their insistence on the ambiguity that has attended the life from its beginning, the same ambiguity that the life itself always moved through, with the specific and unhurried quality of a person who had long since accepted that the precise coordinates of the life were less important than the quality of engagement with whatever coordinates were available. He was buried in Kumamoto. The grave is still there, or a grave that is understood to be his grave is still there, in the specific and modest way that the graves of serious people are often modest, not announcing themselves with the scale and grandeur that the legend of the person might suggest, but simply present, a stone in the earth, marked with the name, receiving the seasons with the same indifference to human significance that the mountains of Harima received the boy with the wooden sword, that the plain of Sekigahara received the young man walking away from the worst day in recent memory, that the island in the strait received the morning that made it famous, that the cave above Kumamoto received the old man with the brush and the lamp, and the question that 60 years of living had made him able to ask in words. The stone is quiet. The cedar forest on the path to Reigando is moving in the wind, with the specific and unhurried quality of trees that are not aware of their own significance, and do not require awareness of it to be what they are. The water sounds below the cave floor. Tok, tok. Patient and steady, and entirely without urgency. The sound of something that has always been here. Shh. Just breathe. Let the cave hold you. Let the water sound below you in the dark. Let the 500 years between the lamp in the cave and the room where you are lying now collapse into the specific and immediate quality of this moment, this breath, this particular and unrepeatable instant of being here. The book was written for this, for you, in a cave above a city in Kyushu, by a man with an ink-stained hand and a lamp and 2 weeks, who wanted to leave behind the question, and did. Good night. Shh. Rest now. The morning tide carries everything forward, and the question continues, as it always has, as it always will.